There are rising rates of single people all over the world, including in countries as diverse as the USA, Finland, South Korea, Turkey, Tunisia, and Thailand. There are repeated calls in many regions of the world for men to be intimately involved in the work of caring, especially in the unglamorous, vital work of caring for children and the elderly. Economists debate whether a value should be placed on the contribution of carers, with some voices asserting that care work cannot be reduced to a monetary value. There are others who argue that caring is a vocation, and still others who call it a hobby. There is no doubt that caring has an intrinsic messiness and an intimacy that defy the logic of the market. Yet it is equally true that carers are pivotal, precious in the contribution they make to families, society, and the economy. The word vocation is understood in different ways depending on personal, cultural, and religious perspectives. For some, vocation is narrowly defined as a religious calling. Others understand vocation more broadly, seeing it in caring or delicate professions such as medicine, teaching, social work, or nursing. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann fascinatingly describes vocation as an act of resistance against what he calls the totalizing system, the dominant narrative that tells us who we are and what we are worth. This weekend in Matthew's Gospel, we hear the account of how Jesus begins his public ministry. He calls fishermen, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, individuals shaped by hard labor and economic uncertainty. Jesus calls them to a new purpose, valuing their existing skills honed by fishing and life. These skills included patience, resilience, and attentiveness. Something in Jesus' call resonates deeply with their lived experience, and they leave familiar security to pursue a path not yet clear by becoming activists for a new way of living shaped by trust. From the vantage point of 2026, the decision made by these men to depend on God and one another seems deeply unsettling and naive. The well-known Jesuit James Martin argues that God's call often comes disguised as a disruption. I have no doubt but that the families of the 4 fishermen experienced the disruption that James Martin hints at. Family members must have been baffled by the strange decisions made by men who were the backbone of their local communities. One of the most dominant cultural messages of our secular times is that self-sufficiency is possible. Human happiness and flourishing are assumed to lie entirely within our own control. The spiritual is dismissed as a private illusion. God is reduced to a redundant hypothesis. Hope itself is recast as mere optimism. Interestingly, the first reading from Isaiah arises from a time of political humiliation, military threat, and social fracture. The darkness Isaiah speaks about is not just spiritual, but historical and economic. Walter Brueggemann describes biblical darkness in the following way. It is the lived experience of dislocation when the world no longer works as promised. In 2026, dislocation is not always dramatic or visible, but it is widespread and deeply felt. Adult couples in their 30s and 40s find themselves living in a single bedroom in a parent's house, postponing children, privacy, and independence, not by choice, but by necessity. Isaiah describes a light shining that does not erase wounds, but reorients the wounded. Isaiah describes the journey from gloom to joy and abundance as the fruits of God's restorative work. Isaiah shares the vivid description of God smashing the old dark ways. Contemporary theologians like James Allison interpret this smashing as God's saving action enacted not against people, but against the mechanisms that deform and dislocate people. Paul, in our second reading, describes factions forming around favored leaders. Paul describes a rift rooted in rivalry caused by elevating personalities above Christ. Paul is critical of what modern psychology calls othering. Paul condemns status and power dynamics that fuel factionalism. Today, rivalries within families often emerge for recognition, attachment to roles, or identity conflicts. In charities, territorial loyalties disrupt mission focus. The same happens when identities become tied to founders. In politics, echo chambers often create factions where compromise is seen as weakness. Dislocated people in 2026 live between promise and fulfillment, between weariness and hope. This weekend's scriptures encourage people struggling to find their own home, to live by hope, trusting that gloom is not their destiny. Isaiah's message to our political system is unambiguous. It calls for the reform needed so that families may live in dignified housing. Paul, rooted in the image of the crucified Christ, encourages not uniformity of opinion, but unity of purpose. People choose different paths. Some opt for the single life. Others pursue religious vocations, politics, and others still caring professions. The Christian understanding is that a vocation is always a call to communion. It is the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. Amen.